Has Donald Trump met his match in Vladimir Putin? Is the president heading for a constitutional crisis with the Supreme Court? And how much economic pain can Republicans endure before the midterm elections? Hi, I'm Riz Khan. Welcome to the show. With the administration's first 100 days in the rearview mirror, let's look ahead to a new chapter which began with a presidential visit to the Gulf. Hands were shaken, deals were signed, gifts were offered, but the path ahead is littered with obstacles on both domestic and international fronts. Donald Trump's already faced a tricky time pushing his big, beautiful bill through Congress and will face further battles with the Supreme Court over a number of his executive orders. Meanwhile, the path to a Nobel Peace Prize seems obscured by the latest developments in Gaza and Ukraine. Well, I've turned to the senior Republican strategist and Washington insider, Adolfo Franco, for his take on prospects for Donald Trump's next 100 days. Adolfo Franco, great to speak with you again.
Delighted to be here.
I'm going to start by asking you, what have you liked the most and perhaps disliked the most about Donald Trump's presidency so far?
Well, I think what I've liked the most is what most Americans expected was to fulfill his promises. I don't think whether one agrees or disagrees with President Trump that one can say he's not doing what he promised. I've yet to see someone say, well, he never said that during the campaign. So I think I am delighted that most politicians make promises and they don't keep those promises. I think the slogan that's being used by the White House is the right one. Promises made, promises kept. What the criticisms, if I may, although I support President Trump, have been that some of them have been the shock and awe, which I understand, is a little bit the awe before the shock, meaning people are stunned at some of the things that are being done regarding, for example, immigration and the deportation and the issues regarding the First Amendment issues of students and the rest of it, which has been the judicial issues that have involved. It's so great to implement those policies, or whether it's the appropriations issues and so forth. And I understand them, but it's been we have a system that we have to respect and work within that system. And I think one can accomplish both. And the president, I think, is coming to realize that after about 100 days that maybe the gas off the pedal. People got the message, is delivering, but now it has to be done in a way that's within our system.
So I'm going to flesh out some of those issues you raised as we talk. But talking of the 100 days, President Trump celebrated it as the most successful 100 days in history. Whereas, of course, the polls have shown something very different, and he's had record low approval ratings. Even Fox News reported widespread disapproval of his economic policies. Who should we believe?
Well, one has to understand President Trump is not a conventional politician. So people who follow President Trump, and I'm one of them that did since the 1980s, has been an individual that is always promoting himself and his agenda. And I mean that in the good sense of the word. So this isn't an individual that looks at polls and the rest of it. When you hear President Trump, it's always going to be the greatest thing that's ever happened. It's going to be the greatest thing. I know we'll talk about tariffs and other issues. It's going to be fantastic. So it's just his style. And that, of course, has been the pluses and minuses. And I'm not ducking the question here. The pluses and minuses of the American people, they feel it's refreshing to have someone speak candidly, sometimes in a very brash way. But by the same token, those individuals, when they try to put those things in the traditional paradigm, it doesn't seem to fit. And what I mean by all of those words is, this 100 days might indeed be the greatest 100 days of many of these policies ultimately, whether they be the immigration, the economic policies, the tariffs, if they actually bear fruit. In the longer term, people will look back at these 100 days as when things were set in motion and they needed to be set in motion. If they don't, it will not be the greatest 100 days. Taking polls, and I'm a big believer in polls, so I'm not going to cherry pick here, is a little bit like taking your blood pressure. It changes daily, and it changes on the stress that one is under, whether it be economic stress or other stress. So they're valid, but you have to have the long game here.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Having had such a high rate of popularity to get him elected, it seems like quite a massive fall in just a matter of months, couple of months.
Well, I think most of the fall has been because of the economic policies and the economic uncertainty that's been certainly caused, at least short term, by the tariff policies. The president has said that you're going to have at least short term, sometimes even midterm pain. And the threshold of pain the American people have today is very, very low. I mean, they're just not, this isn't the 1940s and 50s where people endured pain or the Great Depression. I think Americans have gotten used to a very affluent lifestyle, and they're unwilling to make any type of sacrifices. I would say the same thing if it were President Biden or a Democrat. So the situation and the dramatic change has been that people have not seen, as he promised, that prices would come down day one, for example, be there for staples or even energy. I think these things are on the right trajectory, but the fact that the particularly economic news has been mixed with respect to stock market performance and the like, people see their 401ks and the rest of it. The expectation, and part of it was set by the president, was that things would change immediately. And they obviously have not changed immediately. I think they are the right policies, but he's right. They're going to be painful at first.
So you're calling for patience, basically, in terms of judging it?
I am. I'm trying to be as candid here. I support the policies. I support what the president is doing. But I don't think that turning around a ship like this is going to be pain-free. It just isn't. I understand in a campaign making a promise, and he made that promise that on day one he would have inflation under control and so forth, has not come to fruition. He can't control that. No president can actually control that. The policies are always going to be mid or longer term. And I do think patience is required. I think the messaging now, I understand it's different than the messaging during the campaign, has been one calling for patience. The president has said we're going to suffer for a period of time. In fact, more recently, he said that there's too much consumerism. People have to stop at what he thinks, not $30, but $3, and you don't have to have all these gadgets and so forth. That's a message of some austerity, meaning he expects prices to go up, at least in the short term.
So, Mr. Franco, what would you expect his priorities to be for the next 100 days?
I think the next 100 days are going to be focused largely on domestically on two issues. The first is, and we've seen the first indications are of making trade deals as we have with the UK. It's not a complete cancellation of the tariffs, as you know. There's still 10% tariffs on some items and so forth, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. The stock market reacted as such, investors, and of course, that's been the message as well from the United Kingdom. So if we move on the economic front, when I say that in terms of international tariffs and so forth, talks in China that are taking place, and so forth, and moving in that right direction, I think we're going to see the next 100 days move, I think, significantly better for the American people. The other, of course, is the agenda in Congress, which is a big, beautiful bill, which the president has referred to, which is a reduction in taxes beyond the extension of the 2017 Trump tax cuts. And he delivers on no tax on tips and no tax on overtime for middle and lower income Americans particularly. That will be a big boom.
Now, of course, politics involves a lot of show.
Sure.
And the media is a big factor in that. But there are some who felt uncomfortable watching the televised cabinet meetings where many of the secretaries that have been appointed by President Trump have made kind of fawning statements expressing awe and amazement about how, the president's been handling everything. Has it felt like that at all to you?
It hasn't. And I think what the president has learned in the first term is he came to Washington as an outsider. He still is an outsider, but now he's an outsider that has some insights. And the insights were learned the hard way. I think Newt Gingrich, our former speaker, wrote a book saying, lessons learned the hard way. The lessons in the hard way is that in the first go around, in the first administration, he relied on a lot of establishment figures who were not loyalists. I think he has turned to loyalist. I believe that fawning that you refer to is genuine. I believe many of the individuals that the president has selected to serve in the cabinet are individuals that admired him, have been his friends and allies for a very, very long period of time. And I think sending that message that there is loyalty is important within the administration, including individuals such as Secretary Rubio now, of State Rubio, who's differed with him in the past. I think the message is clear, and that is there's a Trump agenda, and if you believe in it and are part of it, you have to demonstrate it.
So then how important is it to have strong voices in the cabinet who'd be ready to advise President Trump if they disagreed with any of his executive orders? Now, are there any voices like that around?
Well, I've been here for a long time, and I do have White House sources, and I am tied to it. There's a big difference between the public show and what's going on behind closed doors. The fact of the matter is, for example, there are differences of opinion within the team currently, particularly on the trade side, for example, and you see it's manifested on who has the greater voice, who is sent to Switzerland to negotiate with the Chinese, who isn't. I'm referring to, of course, people like Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Mr. Navarro, the trade representative, and so forth. The same thing holds true with the recent change of the National Security Advisor. I think the president liked Mike Waltz very much, and I'm going to continue to serve in a lesser capacity, being UN ambassador. However, it wasn't just the signal scandal that happened, the signal issue that happened. There were differences of opinion within the security team. I know that the White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles had some differences. So these things are not publicly shown. So there are differences of opinion. And the reason I say that is, had it been in just a uniform message, you wouldn't see this personnel changes. I don't necessarily think you have to have personnel changes when there are differences of opinion, but there are different voices and different opinions that are being voiced within the administration.
Publicly, President Trump doesn't like to be contradicted. Do you think he actually listens to these voices? Is it a proper engagement?
Oh, I think so. I think the president, I know so, the president likes to hear, sometimes I think the president likes to hear arguments among the different members of the cabinet. He does not like disloyalty, but I don't think any president has. I really don't recall. I've been involved in a number of administrations, and I served in the Bush administration. I don't remember anyone coming out and contradicting or the president or having a different point of view that lasted very long. So I think this is consistent. I think in the terms of the Trump administration, why the press makes and its heightened scrutiny of this is because he's not an establishment figure. There's always a level of, I think, trust that the president is looking for, that other presidents maybe took for granted because they had been part of the establishment, had worked with these individuals, had been part of it for a very long time. I worked for George W. Bush. He'd been around for a long time, including in his father's administration. So all the figures that he was engaged with and who he worked in the administration at the key positions, he knew well. President Trump did not, or does not necessarily. So that is the difference. But I don't think in any shape, way, or form that he operates any differently than any other president that demands complete loyalty.
How do you assess Elon Musk's time working in the administration? Is it a job well done or perhaps a chaotic misadventure?
Oh, I think it's a job well done, but a job not finished. Of course, he has said that he will continue on working on these issues, not, of course, to the degree that he's in the past. That was always the plan. That had always been the plan to set these things in motion. I think he's shaken up Washington. Here's what's different. Every president has said exactly what Donald Trump has said. In fact, you should do a collage sometime where you can take words from Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, that have talked about government being too big, too bloated, and that things have to change, and government spending and fraud, waste, and abuse. This has been said repeatedly. In the past, how presidents dealt with this is they would have commissions and blue ribbon commissions and studies and the rest of it. The most significant one was President Clinton when he appointed former Vice President Gore to lead a commission to reinvent government. Well, all the reinventions and all the commissions led to very little. The difference here is there is really now not only serious action has been taken with respect to some agencies, but really concrete plans in very, very short period of time identifying real abuse, real fraud, and spending that's unnecessary, and proposals to either eliminate it or the president taking executive actions that are in some cases being called into question in the courts to address these issues. In that regard, that has been a phenomenal success. No one can point to me to a former commission that ever did anything but study the issue. This administration is actually taking action on recommendations that were made within weeks.
Well, as a Washington insider, how do you rate Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's time? Would he still be around another 100 days?
I think he will be around in the next 100 days. He has been the subject, the president has said it, of the scalp that I think the left has wanted for a period of time. And not only the left, but others, and maybe the establishment as well. Many individuals believe he was not up to the job. This is, of course, very different than Secretary Rubio's position. And Secretary Rubio has, in the State Department, the challenge that many conservative Republicans question his foreign policy views, whether they're consistent, considering what he said in the past with the presidents. They are, of course, now. But Pete Hegseth's situation is sort of the opposite, which is there's no question about his loyalty, his commitment, in broad strokes to what the president stands for and wants to do with respect to the Pentagon. Question is he the most capable or capable person or has the credentials to lead the department? So he's been under an enormous amount of scrutiny in that regard. I think he will be around. I think the president, starting your first questions, which were excellent, the president values loyalty above everything. At the end of the day, if someone's not loyal to you, it doesn't matter how capable they are in terms of furthering your agenda. And I think Pete Hegseth scores 100 when it comes to the loyalty test. And that's what's most important to President Trump.
So were you surprised at the dismissal of Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor? That came as a shock to a lot of people, especially considering the short period of time he'd been in the job. Of course, it gives Mr. Rubio that much more work to do.
Right.
And in terms of Mike Waltz's departure, what does it say about President Trump's, the stability of his cabinet?
Well, I think it's stable. Every administration has some changes. There was a reason, a catalyst, which was this signal controversy with this app. But there were rumblings before, and there were issues that were being raised, I can tell you, within the White House about some disappointment with Mike Waltz from key individuals on the team. So there were questions already. I think this became a reason to do it. I think the president wisely delayed it. He didn't want to have a knee-jerk reaction to the Signalgate situation, which Mike Waltz took full responsibility for. And also, yes, he was removed from that position, but he's also been given or nominated to serve as UN ambassador. So he wasn't shown the door for disloyalty or significant differences of opinion with respect to the president's broader agenda. His views have traditionally been, with respect particularly to Middle East issues and so forth, a little more far supporting of Israel than some of the others in the administration thought should be the case. So I think that was the debate that was going on. I think, again, had that Signal app controversy not been present, I believe Mike Waltz would probably still be in the job, but his days probably would have been numbered anyway.
On that note, Signal is obviously a secure app. A lot of people use it for communications of sensitive nature. Here, of course, information was inadvertently put into the messaging. Do you think that, just again, from the inside, do you think that will affect the way the administration communicates? Do you think it'll have an impact on that? Or is it just simply a case of, again, like with any app, be careful?
I think be careful. Of course, the app has been used in the past. The app has been used in the Biden administration. I'm not the expert on technology. I'm not sure whether that's the right thing to do. I don't think it was a totally careless thing. It wasn't something on just an ordinary app. The big controversy, of course, is how did Jeff Goldberg get invited, a journalist from The Atlantic, or any journalist for that matter, get invited into the chat. I think that was we can debate whether those were war plans and not war plans and so forth. I certainly think that app is not going to be used moving forward significantly or in the same fashion. I don't believe that will happen. But the legitimate question that's raised by Republicans and Democrats is, how does an individual like this reporter get invited onto the app? And that is really careless. And that is something that Mike Waltz took responsibility for, and I think rightly so. In terms of the app, I think there's been some defense of its use, but that's just, I think, covering people's actions for what now will be probably a complete revision of it. Of course, the president has called for that, of a review of what to do with respect to secure communications.
Of course, I mean, I guess more human error than tech error, in theory.
In theory, that is correct. Had the Atlantic's editor not been invited, I don't think we'd be talking about this issue. in all likelihood.
Now, I'd like to get your take on some of the administration policies that were central to President Trump's election campaign. Immigration and the border is an area where he scored highest. And there are some people who support the policy and are very pleased with the results in reducing the number of immigrants and the actions taken. But they're not necessarily happy in the way that the actions have been carried out. Some have described them as kind of cruel and chaotic. What's your take on that?
Well, again, I'm not one to criticize polls because I use them when I've been on campaigns, and I've used them defensively and offensively. So I'm not going to attack the polls. But there are a couple of things about the polls, since you began this conversation with the polls. All the polls indicate that's where the president continues to score the highest in terms of his approval, with the majority of the American people supporting mass deportations, the majority of the American people supporting, of course, what's been a very, very successful control of the border and bring security to the border, although it's not being reported by the mainstream press in the United States the way it should be. It's been a dramatic change. Talk about the first 100 days in that regard, since arguably there are two issues that got Donald Trump elected, the economy and immigration. And you can debate which was the greatest of the two. Immigration, he has delivered. Now, it depends how the questions are asked regarding specifics. And that is, I don't think the American people, depending how the polling questions are asked, like to see the idea of people just being picked up or deported and not having, if you will, broad strokes. And we can debate what due process means and how much due process is necessary. But overall, the president receives very, very high marks for what he's done on immigration and what he's doing on immigration. No one's questioning border security, mass deportations, or the need to get criminals out of the country. Now, you can cherry pick specific cases on how this is done and whether the processes have been followed and so forth. And depending how the polling is asked, then people can say it appears cruel or it doesn't appear just. It depends. But when people know the facts of each of these individual so-called cruel cases, the polling data also indicates the other. Yes, we want these people out of the country.
Well, polls aside, of course, it's a very emotional issue, and people are, seeing the stories that do get highlighted, as you say. The media has maybe cherry picks. But as someone yourself, with Cuban roots, and you've climbed up to be a Washington insider, you're in right up there. How do you regard some of the stories you see and how they're being handled?
Well, I'll take it more than that. I'm more than Cuban roots. I'm actually an immigrant, so I can understand the concern of people involved in here. But the fact of the matter is, who's being targeted here? There are two broad strokes of individuals, but the focus of this administration is to remove people who are here illegally. And the priority of those that are here illegally are those that are committing crimes, criminal elements, and the rest of it. We can talk about due process in a moment, but those are the targets. They're not targeting people who are here legally or people here on visas and green cards, except on the other, when you're talking about the individuals who are here legally, those are usually students or individuals that are here temporarily as guests, in most cases. And Secretary Rubio, who is not Donald Trump, has said if you're here as a guest of the United States, you come under the conditions for which you have stated in your visa application that you wished to come to the United States. I can assure you, since I've been in government, and I've been in many, many consular offices around the world, is that if you were to state on your application, I'm coming to the United States as a student and to join an anti-Israel, pro-Hamas activist movement at NYU, your visa application would be denied. That is the discretion of a consular office. And to make sure that the policies and the foreign policy objectives of the United States are not interfered with by foreigners. So it depends what that is in terms of free speech. And that is views versus activism. And those are all going to be judgment calls. And I think on a case-by-case basis, and I understand back to the cherry-picking situation as the thousands and thousands of cases that are involved across the board, be they illegal immigrants, criminals, or those so-called activists, you'd be hard-pressed to just show me a case where somebody just expressed a view and their visas were yanked. These are people who are organizing, who are carrying on activities that I think as an American citizen, I would not be allowed in Europe or other countries to do.
There are people worried that it's effectively now a weaponized tool and that it can be used to just silence people, even if they are just expressing an opinion. That's the fear.
Well, might be the fear, but the fear, I think, doesn't match the reality. I don't think that matches the reality. And the question is about visas and those that are here as guests of the United States is subjective. Under our law, we have absolutely no obligation to let anybody into the country to study, to work, or do anything else, subject to independent review. And the government that's in power at the time can make those judgments. So it's important to understand that. I do not believe people expressing a view has been the problem. It's people who are expressing the views and have turned them into activism and organization and disruption, which of course doesn't get the same coverage, harassing Jewish students, occupying buildings, or fomenting and supporting those activities. Yes, those are legitimate targets for deportation.
So I'll ask you in a line, Mr. Franco, how would you assess the state of freedom of speech in America right now then?
I think it's greater than it ever has been. I think under this administration, and when we started some conversations on Elon Musk, I think the greatest thing is X. Just to listen to the testimony of individuals like Mr. Zuckerberg from Facebook. He's no conservative. He's millions of dollars to get Democrats elected, and he said he was being censored in the Biden administration. The Biden administration set up an office of misinformation. Who is the judge of misinformation? You're in the journalistic field. Who decides what misinformation is? Who decides what points of view are hate speech, and who decides that? There's more free speech today than ever. Now, that does not apply to individuals that are here as guests of the United States who are involved in activism. And there are laws that really impede those individuals from doing so if the Secretary of State, as he has done, certifies that they're impeding the foreign policy objectives of the United States.
So on that note, there have been a number of legal challenges over the deportations, and there are circumstances, are there any circumstances in which you think it's okay to ignore the Supreme Court's decision-making? Isn't that going to present a constitutional crisis if that happens?
Well, I hope the dictates and the instructions of the Supreme Court are never challenged by President Trump or any president if there's a clear ruling. We can talk about specifics if you like. So that would be more than a constitutional crisis. That would be a situation where our system would be really taxed, and it would be a crisis, obviously. But I do not believe that's the case that we have today. Today it's a case of, which is again cherry picking, to use that term, where district judges across the country are being shopped. There's a shopping for these people. And the most liberal jurisdictions, typically Washington, D.C., Obama appointed or Biden appointed, Clinton appointed judges who will order injunctions and all kinds of relief on individual cases that are legitimately brought before them. So that's the test that I think we're facing in the country, is that ultimately the Supreme Court, I think, hasn't really fully decided on how to handle that. And there are divisions on the Supreme Court as to who conducts policy for this government, foreign or other policy. So that's going to be the real test. But in terms of the narrow question that you had about the Supreme Court, you can ask me about an individual case. If it decides something, that's the decision of the Supreme Court. It's not because it's right, it's because it's final.
How supportive are you of President Trump's tariff policy?
Well, I am completely supportive of tariffs in two fronts. As an instrument to get what the president has said is necessary, which is a fair deal for the United States across the board. Tariffs per se, we've lived it through Smoot-Hawley in the 1920s and 30s, are a recipe for disaster. They were a recipe in disaster before there was a global economy, and now today it would be catastrophic if that would be the policy of the United States to impose these tariffs permanently. The president was recently asked, actually at the Oval Office, are these permanent? And his answer was, of course not. So it's to get people to the table as it's happening today. But why it's important to impose these tariffs are for two reasons. I worked on the Central America Free Trade Agreement, and it took years and years and years to resolve the smallest of issues involving agricultural products and a host of other things. What's happened is the system has been manipulated, particularly by China, by others, have been manipulated to give an unfair advantage to many of our trading partners. And that's just, I think anybody objectively looking at that, Democrats included, agree with that. Their solution is to study, to get into negotiations that are prolonged and prolonged and prolonged. It's a little bit like Iran with its nuclear deal, which we might talk about. And that is continuing to prolong discussions and discussions. Well, of course, refinement is, and they're refining uranium and things are moving along nicely. Same thing with China. You know, China sent it to the World Trade Organization, the World Trade Order, over 20 years ago, and things are being under study, and things have taken whatever, and then nothing changes. All this time, there's an unfair advantage. So they're instruments to get the level playing field. That does not mean to give the United States an advantage, but I think the president is absolutely right. And again, you go back, just as I said about government being too large, too inefficient, and too wasteful. You could hear those same comments about trade made by President Obama, by President Clinton, and President Bush. The exact same comments that President Trump has said. The difference, again, like these first 100 days, the president has acted on them. That's part of the shock and awe, and that is what I think world leaders fear about President Trump. They don't know what he'll do. They don't know when he's kidding. They don't know when he's serious. They don't know when he has an agenda. And frankly, a couple of times he has said, I don't even know. So therefore, you have an unpredictable player in the White House. And I think that can work to the advantage of the United States.
Isn't there a danger, though, of simplifying the way global trade is conducted? It's such a web now. It's so intricately broken up and then yet connected that to kind of label products in a single way. I mean, cars are a prime example where parts come from different countries, they go through different routes. There's no single vehicle that's made in one place that comes in and can just be labeled as a foreign vehicle anymore.
Well, that's true. In fact, automobiles, as you use that as an example, is a case in point. There isn't an American-made car. And Ford will tell you that, or General Motors, because if you have an American-made car, they're going to be parts that are coming from someplace else. That's absolutely true. In the past, though, I can turn the question around, has been, oh, that's an American-made car, either because it was assembled here, or the little tiff that Mr. Navarro had with Elon Musk. It's not an American car. Either they're assembled with parts from overseas, they're either foreign or they're not. So yes, there are complexities, but there's some bottom line issues, and they have to do with particular barriers to our products, and they're barriers to entry, and they're not limited to China. China, I think, is the worst offender in terms of how it manipulates the trade rules, and I think there's bipartisan view on that. But we try to export rice to Japan, or until recently, even beef or products to Britain until recently. So these issues, how many American cars are being driven in South Korea or in Japan, or these are barriers. These are barriers that have existed. And for a long time, just the largeness of the American economy, for other complex reasons as well, permitted other countries, as the president has said, to get rich while we slowly got poorer. Ultimately, this was why Asia and large parts of Europe developed very nicely, is because we were playing at a disadvantage. There's no question about that. Those are airlines, the subsidies that foreigners give to their industries, and the protectionism that exists. It just doesn't exist in the United States. So there's a point here, there's a breaking point where that's nice that these countries became rich largely at rules that favored them. He's just straightening and making the rules fair, not give us an advantage, but make them more fair.
Now, you've more or less answered this, but I've got to put it to you this way as well. Views on Donald Trump's tariff trade policy range from suggestions that he's a tactical genius playing four-dimensional chess to the totally opposite view. One quote described it as his team simply trying to stop him eating.
Well, I think he's a tactical genius. The question I have is, how long the American people will have patience for this, and that is a question. To rectify and change the rules is going to be painful. There's no question. There is absolutely no question. If people think they felt it now, if these tariffs come into they haven't. There are pauses and there have been delays and all kinds of signals of deals coming and so forth. But if these things come into pass over a long period of time, over any significant period of time, it would be extraordinarily painful on the American people. It's a little bit like a diet or exercise. The results are down the pike. There's no easy fix. I don't know of anybody. I worked on Capitol Hill for a long time on the Ways and Means Committee and so forth. I don't know anybody who's ever told me that the trade rules were fair for the United States. They recognized all kinds of geopolitical reasons that we had to make accommodations to countries like Vietnam and so forth, and of course our allies. And I understand that, but the bottom line is American workers suffer, and ultimately the country is going to be poorer if we don't rectify them.
I was saying, Mr. Franco, several business leaders have warned President Trump's ambition to bring manufacturing jobs back into the USA on a large scale won't happen because Americans won't want to do them and because the supply chains don't exist in the US to support them. So do you feel that the goal of manufacturing jobs coming back to home is really a visible ambition of the policy?
It's a long-term one, and I think it is visible. I mean, many of the countries that have, there's a notion that somehow Americans don't want to do this type of work, and some 1950s idea of someone in a very large plant or so forth. Of course, today it's a much more automated, it's a much more sophisticated type of worker, and many of the individuals carrying out this work are living in first world countries that are our competitors. So if Japanese workers are willing to do this, if South Korean workers are willing to do this, Canadians and others in Europe are willing to do it, I believe Americans are as well. So, but the issue, again, this is very long term. The President has said that it's going to be $8 trillion of investment in factories in the U.S. and business returning home. I think that's true, but we're not going to see the fruits of those endeavors for many years. In the interim, there will be pain as well.
Well, that's the thing. I'm wondering, you've said that it's been a very unlevel playing field up to now. And I wonder how you feel that these measures will actually have an impact on America's trading partners, how that relationship might evolve or devolve.
Well, I think they will adapt as well. I think it will, it's hard for me to say exactly how. I think it will be very hard on the Chinese economy. But in terms of the trading partners of Japan and the EU and others, I think it will be a challenge. There's no question about that in terms of the U.S. market. There will be challenges involved in that. I think, frankly, looking for new markets and emerging in other markets. Life's constant change. There are other markets that beyond the U.S. that our trading partners can look for if it's a more level playing field. Also, when we level the playing field, and I think we're doing that with the UK, for example, that's just leveling it. That doesn't mean that people won't continue to buy BMWs and Volkswagen and other agricultural products from other countries. It's just that we'll be more competitive. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember when the only foreign car, other than luxury sports cars and Rolls-Royce, was a Volkswagen. And that was a very niche market for people who really couldn't afford anything else. And every car was an American car. So somehow, we've gone way in the other extreme. Does that mean that Japan and South Korea will go into some separate depression? I don't think so. I think China is now the world's largest car manufacturer, and they're not selling cars in the U.S.
If the argument that tariffs will lead to higher prices for Americans and then lead to increased inflation do appear, what is the plan? What is the solution for trying to make it manageable? I know you said there's a painful period ahead, but still, it has to be manageable because policies go on, politics go on election cycles, and we've got the midterms coming. I'll ask more about that in a moment, but what's the solution? Well,
that's an excellent question. The solution is, which we haven't talked about, is tax reform and fiscal reform in the government. Not necessarily just cutting government spending, which people don't see in their pocketbooks directly overnight, but actual tax cuts. And I mean tax cuts across the board significantly, particularly for lower income Americans. As I said, he's mentioned Social Security. As a possibility. That's a little more complicated to get the tax off Social Security. 85% of Social Security is taxed currently at the federal level. That's a little more difficult to do. But tax on tips, tax on overtime, and greater tax cuts across the board for middle-income Americans. That would ease things. People will see that quite immediately. Of course, whether we touch the corporate tax rates and bring them down as well, it's a way to incentivize the U.S. economy. I think Wall Street and Main Street would both react very favorably to that, and that would ease some of the pressures that will be coming from tariffs and inflation as a result of that.
Do you think the Federal Reserve should be able to make interest rates policies without interference from the president?
Well, they have that authority, of course, and the President Trump's voicing of his opinions on, of course, he has said recently he's not going to fire the Federal Reserve chairman, whom he appointed. But there is question whether he has that authority. He has pushed the limits on some other federal independent agencies in that regard. There's a question whether he has it. So president can do what they call the bully pulpit. He can speak all the time he wishes. The discourse in the country is very different than it was 30 or 40 years ago. People will not say the things so directly about the Federal Reserve, but presidents would voice concerns that they would wish interest rates would go down, that interest rates need to come down. They wouldn't target individuals or the Federal Reserve per se. But the national discourse and politics and the rest of it is very different today than it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But it is independent. It has that authority. It does act independently. President cannot influence it, will not be able to influence it.
Every president coming in, and I think almost everywhere in the world, points to the foibles of the predecessor for what they've inherited. Is this, in your opinion, Biden's economy or Trump's economy?
Well, it's Biden's economy now, and for this reason. And I'm not going to say this the next time we have an interview in 6 months or hopefully sooner, but and certainly in a year. But you cannot say, the president recently spoke last week when there was just reports on some issues economic data that came out on inflation, for example. You can't be in office 6 or 7 weeks and say that it's all because of Donald Trump, particularly things such as inflation and the jobs numbers and the rest of it. That's just in the pipeline. So it's it's going to take a few months. What is his is the policies that are moving forward, and that is, for example, stock market and so forth. Reaction is in large part related to what the president says or does not say, for example, about tariffs. But the underlying economic data and what's happening in the economy, it just takes a period of time to move away from the previous policy. So it is still Biden's for a short period of time.
I was going to say, people do comment on how remarkable the swings have been based on what President Trump says when it comes to the stocks.
Well, yes, it depends. It depends on the date and where it is and the circumstances. But increasingly, I think this will certainly within 6 months of this presidency, halfway through the year, it will be Donald Trump's, as it was Joe Biden's. It wasn't Joe Biden's on day one either.
Economics and tariffs apart, Mr. Franco, how do you regard America's relationship with its allies? Have they been strengthened or have they been weakened under President Trump?
I think they've been strengthened in a private way, not in a public way, because, of course, the president's strategy is make America great and America first policy. And I don't think that can be embraced in Europe and most other places in the world. I just don't think that they can say this is what we want. It sounds as though we're moving away from our allies. But ultimately, the objectives, and many of the foreign leaders that have been not necessarily Trump supporters in Europe and elsewhere have said as much. What the president is trying to accomplish with respect to a solution with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, I think they applaud. And the same thing with respect to what's going on in the Middle East and even in Iran. I think allies do want the United States to stand up to China, for example, and be prepared to take a leadership role. Is the president going to do this through these United Nations efforts or these formal alliances or so forth? No. I think there was probably disappointment on the climate issue. That's legitimate. That is a change in policy. There's no question about that. But ultimately, I think there's a sense that the United States is embarked upon flexing its influence overseas and certainly increase military spending, which he has pledged to do. And I think allies welcome that.
There are those who feel America's muscles were flexed a bit too hard, perhaps. The most northern neighbour you've got here, the ally Canada, a bit of friction with the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. In fact, he got elected on essentially an anti-Trump stance.
Yes.
It kind of turned everything upside down very quickly, and he managed to get in. How do you regard what happened up there?
Well, the president said, thank God that I was elected. You wouldn't be here, Mark, when he referred to Prime Minister Carney. So he's probably right on that. I think the president, again, feels, and that I think he has felt this, if you listen to interviews with Donald Trump from even the 1980s and 90s, that, what does he say, Canada's gotten a free ride, and others. And I think whether it's, in the past, there's been more of a focus on Europe and NATO, particularly in terms of military spending, which, by the way, is accurate, and every president has complained about it. They don't honor necessarily all their pledges, all the member states. That Canada has been, as the president has said, protected by the United States, benefited from the United States, and yet feels that Canada, with respect to trade and other issues, has taken advantage of the United States. I think that course correction will be short. The president said he had a very positive meeting. They both characterized it as positive, despite some colorful comments that were made. But the president's position, again, you can't view him through the prism of a conventional politician. What conventional politician says they're going to buy Greenland, or they're going to have the U.S., Canada be the 51st state? It's just not, it's not in the cards. Ultimately, these sort of statements that everybody is, I guess, a little accustomed to now, but they're unconventional, ultimately lead to some arrangements that were better than what existed previously. So this is the kind of person that goes for the gold, so to speak, and settles for the bronze.
Well, I was going to ask you how serious President Trump is about his plans for Greenland, Gaza, Panama.
Well, I think with respect to Greenland, I think you'll see heightened U.S. military cooperation, maybe U.S. military bases established in Greenland, expanded. And I think you'll see a larger role for the U.S. in Greenland as a consequence of that. I think in Panama, Secretary Rubio was in Panama, making very, very clear that China's influence on the canal and its use of the canal, and priority even in terms of some of the commercial shipping, much less any military use of it, is curtailed if it's going on. And certainly there's been a warning flag from the U.S. that this needs to stop. Again, these are the types of things that I think are positive, and that by taking these steps that are viewed by these states, understandably, as threatening, that ultimately an accommodation is made. And I think that's how Donald Trump, in his entire career, has negotiated his art of the deal, is not the art of diplomacy, but the art of the deal.
Well, there's many who'd agree with you that he's not a conventional politician,
No, of course
not
not.
having had a politician background either, but that he does actually deliver on what he says, or at least tries to. Now, he did say he could end the Russia-Ukraine war in a day. That obviously hasn't happened. But the interesting dynamics taking place on that front with Russia and Ukraine are really confusing a lot of people. How did you regard that scene in the White House with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky?
Well, I think it was a clear signal to Russia that he was not going to be in Zelensky's pocket, or Ukraine was. That was the perception in the Biden administration, I think very clearly, that it was all Ukraine. By the same token, and that was harsh, of course, that exchange. Same token, within 2 weeks, he was criticizing President Putin very strongly, which people said he was in his pocket and he was a Putin fan and so forth. And he said Putin had to step up to it. Fact of the matter now, there are serious discussions and talks, how it's all shaking out again. I mean, when was there a serious talk about a ceasefire, or calling for a complete ceasefire, as Ukraine has called for, complete ceasefire? And when have we seen this type of serious negotiation during the entirety of the Biden administration? We didn't see it. It was one of just arming Ukraine, and in many cases defeating Russia and the Western alliance and so forth. I understood all that, but it certainly wasn't one to bring about peace. Did it happen on day one? No. Did inflation end on day one? No. Is this a work in progress? I think so. I think there's more. No one can point to the degree of progress regarding certainly a ceasing of hostilities that was never on the table, seriously, during the Biden administration.
Did you get a sense that the relationship with Volodymyr Zelensky was patched up at the Pope's funeral, Pope Francis's funeral?
I think it was patched up before. I think much of this is for when I use the word posturing, I think it's a signal to the world of the United States being willing to take a dramatic change, but at the same time, ultimately, not going to abandon Ukraine. So I'm not dismissing it as hot and cold. I calculated, but it wasn't as harsh as it seemed. I think it was just a question, again, of Donald Trump saying, I mean business, and we need to get this done. And this isn't going to be prolonged, and you can't count on the United States. I think President Zelensky said it. We want an honest broker, but want you to be more on our side. I understand what he was saying by that. His answer was, no, I want a deal on this. And that is a change in policy. So I don't think the Pope's funeral is where they patched it up. I think it was patched up even before.
Actually, a lot of people are surprised at J.D. Vance's intervention there at the White House. That was the one I think surprised a lot of people. So,
yes, it was a curious one. It was I think J.D. Vance, of course, is seen by many in the Trump movement as not only the vice president, but will inherit the MAGA movement.
We'll get onto that in a second. But when it comes to Vladimir Putin, as you indicated, President Trump wasn't necessarily so happy with the lack of response from President Putin. In fact, the suggestion he was played has come up, and I think he used the term tapped along, by President Putin. Who has the upper hand at this stage, do you think? And how will President Trump react if it's Vladimir Putin who seems to be holding the cards?
Well, I think ultimately the Ukraine has the upper hand. I really believe that, because at some point, despite the signals that have been sent by the United States, it can be back on again, to use that expression, meaning there's an eagerness, particularly in Europe, to make sure that Ukraine has strong support, to say the least. And I think the United States is prepared, if there isn't movement from Russia, to simply say, you will see the same harsh rhetoric directed more harshly toward Putin, and say they're not serious about it, and the only way they're going to be serious about it is if Ukraine is now strengthened and the position has become hardened. So I think ultimately, I think the advantage is with Ukraine. I really believe that.
Although President Trump did get to the stage where he said, look, we'll just walk away from this if we have to.
Yes, he has said that, but the United States will not walk away from it. Even that is a threat, really, to both sides. Obviously, the Russian side is, despite everything they've made, I know it's a war of attrition, it remains very, very difficult for them to actually seal the deal with respect to Ukraine. They would have done it long ago.
As someone who obviously knows Donald Trump and how strong he is as a character, what chance is there he's met his match with people like Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Mark Carney in Canada?
I don't think he's met his match. I think, of course, those countries, particularly China, to some extent Russia as well, is those economies and their military prowess is really we have to take into account more than the personalities involved in it. I don't think he's met his match. I don't think he's worried about that. Certainly with the Prime Minister of Canada, he is not. With Prime Minister Carney, I don't think he is. However, I do believe that President Trump, and I do know him in this regard, is if he feels that he's not being taken seriously, or people have gotten the upper hand, or they're willing to not take what he said as something that they need to engage negotiations with, then he'll up the ante significantly. And I think he has with China, of course. We haven't talked about China, what's going on internally in China, but I don't believe the Chinese economy, despite what they're saying, is growing by 5%. I just don't believe it. I don't believe anything coming from China, period. So 145% tariffs on China, idle factories and so forth. We don't talk much about their pain because it's a closed society. And the same thing with respect to Canada. Ultimately, Canada's the biggest loser. Canada has 40 million people. We have nearly, not quite, but nearly 9 times the size of the population, and the economy is greater. They need the United States more than we need them. Keep in mind that the size of the Russian economy is the size of the economy of Texas. So at the end of the day, the leverage isn't just the personality. I think President Trump's personality and his willingness to use power in an unconventional way or to threaten its use, I think, is an important component, and that's factored in. But ultimately, it's the United States of America today still remains the superpower.
Could a nuclear deal with Iran actually be easier than getting the peace deal for Ukraine?
I'm not certain about that, and it will depend. These next few days, next weeks, it will be very, very critical. The problem with the Iran deal is trust but verify, and I'm sorry, I don't believe that the previous agreement by the Obama administration was the kind of verification that I think is satisfactory to President Trump of the United States, despite what was being said. So, with Iran, I think the fear is delay. Again, I've mentioned that before. Indirect talks, direct talks. These talks have been fruitful today, but remember, Iran just a few weeks ago had said it would only engage in indirect talks. And then, of course, direct talks took place. So it's a question of not only talking, but action. We keep hearing Iran is just a few weeks away from the development of nuclear arms. People have been saying that for years. So you have to start assuming that they either have them or about to have them, so time is running out. And that is why I don't think it's necessarily as easy, because any deal, a real deal with Iran, a real deal will require Iran to cease refinement. And the Iranian positions have been hard on that to date.
Well, Donald Trump has talked about wanting to serve a third term. Would you like to see that?
Well, he said he wouldn't. He just recently said that it looks like we'll be over in 4 years. Obviously, a Constitution impedes that. I think. I
was wondering whether you'd like.
Oh well, yeah, I would like to see that. But I think there are those. You mentioned the vice president. Those that are now have genuinely in the last 8 years. I wouldn't have thought this 8 years ago. But because they've seen what's happened to the Republican Party, I think it's very difficult to see how a Republican can win the nomination and support the majority of Republicans without being a Donald Trump MAGA supporter. Not a Trump look-alike or act-alike, but in terms of the policies, they have to be very similar.
And you see J.D. Vance as a worthy successor?
I do see J.D. Vance, and I know that Donald Trump Jr. was critical in selecting then Senator Vance, who many people believed was the wrong choice. They were looking for diversity of women, minorities, and so forth. And that was even true to Donald Trump not being hypocritical and putting a woman on the ticket, or a great person, Senator Scott, who's African American from South Carolina. So that in and of itself was an indication that a loyalty test to the MAGA movement was paramount.
Well, there's been a lot of wrangling internally with the Democrats in how to deal with the Trump presidency. Could you see them actually getting their act together and putting forward a sort of cohesive plan to challenge the Republicans?
They could, but I don't think they will. Every indication is that the party tends to want to move more to the left. The leading voices, at least speaking right now, are again Senator Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The more extreme views in the Democratic Party seem to be what is dominant at this time. I believe the Democratic Party could be quite viable if it were a centrist party. I really do believe that many of the things, if it were genuinely were embraced, such as immigration policy, things that are important to the American people, this broadly speaking, wokeism and cultural issues, if those were tempered in many ways, I think the Democratic Party would be very viable. I just don't see in the primaries the Democrats doing so.
What do you expect to happen in the midterm elections?
Well, the midterms, of course, are always terrible for the party in power. And I say always, I should take that back. I was involved in midterms in 2002 when they weren't. We picked up seats, but that was after 9/11. And there are times where one can do well. President Biden did fairly well on his midterms. But the margins are close in the House, particularly. And they will hinge totally on tax policy and tariff. It will all be economic issues, barring a catastrophic terrorist attack or a type of conventional war we haven't seen in many decades. Foreign policy issues never dominate on our elections unless it's a catastrophic event.
But you have the issue of the pain of the economy. Yes. And I wonder, you might reach a stage where the Republicans start to say, hey, we're going to lose our seats unless there's a change in course.
I think there's already sentiment in that regard. And you see it, without getting into the weeds here, you see it with respect to the SALT tax, which are taxes that are imposed on real estate and so forth on certain key states to hold on to key districts in New York, for example, and in New Jersey. And so that is a fear for the elections. That pain window for Republicans in the House is short, much shorter than President Trump, and we'll see how that shakes out. That's why tax policy and tax reform is going to be critical. They need to deliver.
To wrap this up, I'm going to bring it full circle to where we started.
Sure.
And I wonder how you regard the fact that so many people are surprised that Donald Trump did actually deliver or tried to deliver on the promises he made in the campaigns.
Well, I think they're surprised because they don't, even though they see him as a non-politician, they still don't expect politicians to deliver. And he did deliver on these things. Now, there are two types of reactions to it. To those of us who support President Trump, we're delighted. True to his word, this is what he said. He has not retreated in any shape, way, or form. In fact, more so than he promised when he talked about tariffs and so forth, but he didn't waffle on these issues. To Democrats, and that's why the country continues to be polarized, that's that shock value is, this is why we opposed him, and this is now very fearful. They're very fearful of what it means for the country, and they had wished he had not and didn't expect him to do so. So again, it's back to almost November of last year, the country being quite divided. Either this is the course we want to go on, and he's delivering, or this is exactly what we feared.
Adolfo Franco, thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Interesting insights there from the senior Republican strategist and Washington insider, Adolfo Franco. And that's it for this episode. I'm Riz Khan. Please do subscribe to the show and leave us any comments and feedback. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.